For any homework-related queries, call us at +1 678 648 4277. You can mail us at support@pythonhomeworkhelp.com, support@pythonhomeworkhelp.com, or reach us at www.pythonhomeworkhelp.com. Introduction. You will use object-oriented programming, classes and inheritance, to build a program to monitor news feeds over the internet. Your program will filter the news, alerting the user when it notices a news story that matches that user's interests. For example, the user may be interested in a notification whenever a story related to the Red Sox is posted. This problem set does not require many lines of code. We recommend that the solutions you write for each problem stay under about 15 to 20 lines of code. The solutions for some problems will be much shorter than that. If you find yourself writing way more code than that, you should come visit us at office hours to see how you can simplify things. Here is the official Python tutorial on classes, sections 9.1 to 9.7, except for 9.5.1, will be useful for this set. Chapter 8 in the textbook is also useful. RSS feed filter. RSS overview. News sites, such as Google News, have content that is updated on an unpredictable schedule. One tedious way to keep track of this changing content is to load the website up in your browser and periodically hit the refresh button. Fortunately, this process can be streamlined and automated by connecting to the website's RSS feed, using an RSS feed reader instead of a web browser. An RSS reader, e.g. Sage, will periodically collect and draw your attention to updated content. RSS stands for Really Simple Syndication. An RSS feed consists of periodically changing data stored in an XML format file residing on a web server. For this problem set, the details are unimportant. You don't need to know what XML is, nor do you need to know how to access these files over the network. I've taken care of retrieving and parsing the XML file for you. Data structure design. RSS feed structure, Google News. First, let's talk about one specific RSS feed, Google News. The URL for the Google News feed is http://news.google.com/?output =RSS. If you try to load this URL in your browser, you'll probably see your browser's interpretation of the XML code generated by the feed. You can view the XML source with your browser's view page source function, though it probably will not make much sense to you. Abstractly, whenever you connect to the Google News RSS feed, you receive a list of items. Each entry in this list represents a single news item. In a Google News feed, every entry has the following fields. GUID, a globally unique identifier for this news story. Title, the news story's headline. Description, a paragraph or so summarizing the news story. Link, a link to a website with the entire story. Pub date, date the news was published. Category, news category, such as top stories. Generalizing the problem. This is a little trickier than we'd like it to be, because each of these RSS feeds is structured a little bit differently than the others. So, our goal is to come up with a unified, standard representation that we'll use to store a news story. We want to do this because we want an application that aggregates several RSS feeds from various sources and can act on all of them in the exact same way. We should be able to read news stories from various RSS feeds all in one place. Problem 1. Parsing. See below for a definition. All of this information from the feeds that Google/Yahoo/etc. gives us is no small feat, so let's tackle an easy part of the problem first. Pretend that someone has already done the specific parsing and has left you with variables that contain the following information for a news story. Globally unique identifier, GUID, a string title, a string description, a string link to more content, a string pub date, a date time. We want to store this information in an object that we can then pass around in the rest of our program. Your task in this problem is to write a class news story, starting with a constructor that takes GUID, title, description, link, pub date as arguments and stores them appropriately. News story also needs to contain the following methods: get_GUID, self, get_title, self, get_description, self, get_link, self, get_pubdate, self. The solution to this problem should be relatively short and very straightforward. Please review what get methods should do if you find yourself writing multiple lines of code for each. Once you have implemented news story, all the news story test cases should work. Parsing the feed. Parsing is the process of turning a data stream into a structured format that is more convenient to work with. We have provided you with code that will retrieve and parse the Google and Yahoo news feeds. Triggers. Given a set of news stories, your program will generate alerts for a subset of those stories. Stories with alerts will be displayed to the user, and the other stories will be silently discarded. We will represent alerting rules as triggers. A trigger is a rule that is evaluated over a single news story and may fire to generate an alert. For example, a simple trigger could fire for every news story whose title contained the phrase Microsoft Office. Another trigger may be set up to fire for all news stories where the description contained the phrase Boston. Finally, a more specific trigger could be set up to fire only when a news story contained both the phrases Microsoft Office and Boston in the description. In order to simplify our code, we will use object polymorphism. We will define a trigger interface and then implement a number of different classes that implement that trigger interface in different ways. Trigger interface. Each trigger class you define should implement the following interface either directly or transitively. It must implement the evaluate method that takes a news item, news story object, as an input and returns true if an alert should be generated for that item. We will not directly use the implementation of the trigger class, which is why it raises an exception should anyone attempt to use it. The class below implements the trigger interface. You will not modify this. Any subclass that inherits from it will have an evaluate method. By default, they will use the evaluate method in trigger, the superclass, unless they define their own evaluate function, which would then be used instead. If some subclass neglects to define its own evaluate method, calls to it will go to trigger.evaluate, which fails, albeit cleanly, with the not implemented error. Class trigger, object def evaluate, self, story returns true if an alert should be generated for the given news item, or false otherwise. Raise not implemented error. We will define a number of classes that inherit from trigger. In the figure below, trigger is a superclass, from which all other classes inherit. The arrow from phrase trigger to trigger means that phrase trigger inherits from trigger, a phrase trigger is a trigger. Note that other classes inherit from phrase trigger. Phrase triggers. Having a trigger that always fires isn't interesting. Let's write some that are interesting. A user may want to be alerted about news items that contain specific phrases. For instance, a simple trigger could fire for every news item whose title contains the phrase Microsoft Office. In the following problems, you will create a phrase trigger abstract class and implement two classes that implement this phrase trigger. A phrase is one or more words separated by a single space between the words. You may assume that a phrase does not contain any punctuation. Here are some examples of valid phrases. Purple cow amuo. This is a phrase. But these are not valid phrases. Purple cow contains punctuation. Purple cow contains multiple spaces between words. Given some text, the trigger should fire only when each word in the phrase is present in its entirety and appears consecutively in the text, separated only by spaces or punctuation. The trigger should not be case sensitive. For example, a phrase trigger with the phrase purple cow should fire on the following text snippets. Purple cow. The purple cow is soft and cuddly. The farmer owns a really purple cow. Purple.